In this video, I'm going to cover some common problems seen in the ETL process to get data into staging from a source file. So I've got an example here of some source data that includes a CSV. And let's first look at the CSV here. This is from one of the projects that the class is working on. So we've got some data here, the FIPS code. I'm going to work with just a couple of columns to demonstrate some common issues during the import process, the extraction from this file, the transformation issues that could occur in loading it into staging table. So we've got the FIPS, the state, the area name. I'm going to grab these three columns. I'm also going to grab some integer value columns right here. The census 2010 population, estimates base 2010, population estimate 2010. There's also some values in this data set, some columns that are decimal data type. So for instance, here I'm going to grab this ratio here of birth 2011, 2012, and 2013. So you can see that these are decimal values. And the other thing to observe in this data before we get going here is the total number of records is at 3274, so somewhere around there we'll get with our import. So I'm just gonna close this. I've got a package built and I've got a database built with some tables as a means to understand how we can troubleshoot this ETL process of getting data into staging. So I've got this database I call Data Mart problems, and I've got three different versions of a staging table here. And so we're going to work with the first version here first, and we've got a primary key column. So remember, for every table in Data Mart design, we want to create our own surrogate key column. And so this right here, we're just calling the staging ID. We have the ID that comes from the source system, the FIPS code, state, and then we've got state ID. And remember, these two columns I've identified as dimensions that I will be creating later in another video. So we've got state ID here, area name ID, and then these would be null as the data comes in because these are not included in the source CSV. In addition to that, I've got census, estimates, and population, and notice the data types for these are all integers. So, and then I've have these ratios that we saw were decimals of 5 with precision 2. So we've got this data here, and we've got a varying types of data types. And so the idea would be when we create our ETL package, we would transform this data when inserting in this data in the staging table. But what we're going to demonstrate here is problems that happen when we try to do this. And sort of the thinking process that I go through, and maybe you could get to where you could continue to try to get this correct, okay? And then the second strategy would be you're just really frustrated with the process, and so what you would do is eventually have the target staging table set as varchars, or just variable characters with a little bit of precision set to it so that the data just gets into the staging table. And then what we would do is do further transformation while the data is in staging or at a later time. So it all depends. Either way, you're going to have to eventually get the data into a format that would meet the requirements of the target data mart. So here, we're just troubleshooting things that happen inside of the staging process. So I have an ETL package here in SSIS put together, and I've got 3 different versions of the ETL, and with each of these I'm going to have problems until I get to the last one, so for instance, here in the staging table, in the second staging, I've got some columns that I was having problems with, and then I decided to change all those decimal values to varchars. I still had problems, and then you'll see sort of last resort, I just moved everything as a varchar. And so let's just step through this process. Doesn't mean you have to do this. It's just, this is an option. Either way, eventually you're going to have to transform the data, okay? So let's first look. So right now we have no data in this table. So I'm just going to execute this first, and we're going to go to the ETL package, and you're going to look, I've got a data flow task that I've created in my ETL package, and I call this version 1. So we're going to look inside here, and I've got my flat file data source, which is defined down here by my flat file connection manager. And if we look at that, the way we defined our flat file connection, we've got a text qualifier. Remember, this is just a single double quote right here. It's delimited. The other thing I want you to make note of is I say the header rows to skip. The default value for this is 0. So what would be the advantage of that? Something you might need to do. So if you look at this source data here, you will notice that this first row of data here is an aggregate row where it's all of the United States, and then it breaks it down by state and then by sort of city. So what I wanted to do is just ignore this because the US doesn't have, in this case, a valuable piece of information in the FIPS code, but you would see that these are aggregated totals. Now we're still going to end up having aggregated totals in our data, which we'll deal with later in another video as a means of working with staging data. But right now I want to show you that you can just ignore this row right here, this first row, because we don't want that imported. So by changing this value default from 0 to 1, what that did was, if you look here, the FIPS code starts at 1000 instead of 0. So it just ignores that very first row. Okay, now I understand that we're bringing in the states, but that's okay. Right now our primary goal is just to get data into staging. The other thing I want to make note of is when we go to the Advanced tab of the Flat File Data Source Connection Manager, whenever we have a database, so you'll see eventually, and I'll rehash this here in a little bit, where we have precision defined in a string. So eventually we ended up getting to the size of these characters. And so we want to match that in our device connection manager. So for instance, the state, I changed the precision level to 5, which matches eventually my target column size right here to 5. So whenever we set the advanced property on this side, you can just start by learning with working with strings. It's often a good idea to match the source import there, the extraction process, with the size of the destination, and you'll do that the same thing inside the transformation step, which we'll go over. But that's why you're getting this warning right here. Notice that warning goes away in the 3rd step, but we'll see that as we go along. So the very first attempt that I'm doing here is I've got my flat file source, and I have just the columns, or I've absorbed all of the columns from the flat file source. And what I decided to do was create a data conversion step where I'm just transforming only those fields that I need that go into my destination staging table. So what I'm doing here is I kept the FIPS, the state, the area name as strings. And I decided to start transforming the census, the estimates, and the population estimate values to integers. So this is a 4 bytes unsigned integer. It will hold up to 4 bytes size and integer, and we're just gonna see if that will transform from a string to an integer. And then we also are attempting to transform these strings to decimal values. And then what I did was I just mapped. So remember, during this transformation stage, we rename an output as an alias here, and it's copy of, copy of, copy of. So our output was an alias. And so when we come here to the mappings piece, we map copy of FIPS to FIPS in the destination table, copy of state to state in the destination table, and so forth. So we want to make sure that when we choose from this drop down the field from the transformation step, the data conversion step, so because that's the one that's going to go into the target. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this, and we're going to have problems. So I'm going to execute this task, and it's going to fail. Now it failed during the conversion. Notice I've got green check mark, red X, green check mark. So something happened where some data failed during the data conversion process. While I'm still running, I'm still running because see this red square is still available. If I hit progress, I'm still in debug mode, and you can do this afterward if you want. And there's lots of warnings here, and we'll look at those a little bit later, not all of them, but we've got here our first. So if you just come down from the top and you come down to the first time that you see a failure, this red X here, if you just right click on here, you can copy the message text, and you just open up Notepad and you paste it in. And sometimes it gives you valuable information, sometimes it doesn't, but you really need to just read it no matter what, and you might need to read all of the X's. Here you could see that during execution, data failed to convert on r_birth_2011 on the copy column. So it failed to transform from a string, in this case, to a decimal value. So if we look at it here, I'm just going to hit stop for debug mode, and I'm going to go back to SQL, and I'm just going to execute this, and we've got some data here, and if we scroll down to the bottom, we saw that 2,770 rows failed, and so our import was incomplete because we know we have well over 3,700 rows. So about 1,000 or more failed, so that's not good. So we could further investigate why did it fail, start to look. We could look at the error and respond to that. So the first thing I would say is let's respond to the error and go back and make another version. And you could let me just delete that. It's not really a step there. You could recreate this and try another version, or you could just edit the same version, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to look inside this second version of the task, and what we're going to do is we're going to make an adjustment on the database first. So what I did was, from the first version of the database here, or of the table, not the database, the table, we showed that this r_birth 2011 was a decimal 5.2. Well, we know that it failed to convert that. So I could continue to try to troubleshoot that. If I get frustrated, again, we could do the transformation at a later time in staging. I've created another version of the table, and what I did was I just said, okay, look, I'm not going to transform those into decimals during the initial ETL into staging. So I just made them characters, which will allow accept any character inside of that. And then here I've just added some precision to 5 because these are fairly small strings. So I just set all those to 5 and I left these others as integers. So let's look at the next stage of my ETL package and the next version of it. So what did we do different here? We didn't do anything here in this first step, but in the second step what we did was we said, okay, look, just leave these guys here as strings and let's convert these other 3 as integers, but let's leave these guys alone, and just leave the default size as 50, which is probably not a good choice either, but again, I just want to demonstrate that, you know, we're going to leave those guys alone. And then in our destination here, we map the same thing. We map the copy from the transformation step to each of these. So we're just going to keep mapping that. So no changes there. So let's look at what happens here this time. We're going to execute. And it starts to work, but we get a little bit more data in. So again, we fail at the data conversion step. So if I go to progress and I come down here, we're in debug mode still. And I look at this and I copy this message. And so this is, you know, version 2 errors. And we look, so now we're failing on census here, which is an integer value. So before we were failing here on version 1, we were failing on this transformation to a decimal. Now we're failing on here on a transformation to an integer value. So at this point you're starting to get frustrated. You're getting kind of really flustered with this thing, and so you come in here and you look, okay, well, how much did we get into the second version of our, you look at it, oh, we got a little bit more data, but you know, you're still not happy here. This thing is still failing. We really don't know what's going on. Yeah, not much more, right? 2770 versus 2732. So actually you got less data. So we're still failing here. Either way, you're not there yet. So what do we do? So let's go back and into Management Studio over here. We create a third version of the table. And this time we're like, okay, look, we're going to eliminate not only transformation into staging with these ratios that are represented as decimals, but we're just going to eliminate our troubleshooting process with transforming these data into integers. And we're even eliminating, there was one other column in the FIPS, instead of making that an integer, basically we just set everything as a varchar except the area name ID and the state ID, which we said those were going to be null anyway because those are not even in the source. So essentially I've taken every single column that we grabbed from the source CSV and turned it into a varchar with a little bit of precision. And if you're unsure of the precision, meaning you don't know, let's say you're dealing with hundreds of thousands or millions of rows, you might have to just be very greedy with precision and bump this up to 8,000. You just have no idea how big the data is coming in, so you're that much more frustrated. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our ETL, and we've got a third version of this right here, and let's look at what we did differently here. The first thing that we did was nothing different on this flat file data source. Nothing's different there, but what we did here was we left everything as a string. We also matched up our precision length here with what was in our database. So for instance, the FIPS we have as a varchar 10. We also have that as 10, and all of these sizes match. We also made sure, if we look at our flat file connection manager, we made sure here, for instance, FIPS, this matches as 10 here in the advanced tab for each of these. So state we matched as 5. Again, these all match up with precision of the database. So if you can imagine we're matching up everything in our flat file connection manager with the precision of characters. We match everything here in our data conversion step exactly. So all of that matches. And so then over here in our mappings, we also make sure that the copy version from our transformation step matches our destination here. So everything matches, which is also why that warning goes away. So a very, very sort of greedy ETL process to get data into staging. We've exhausted our options. We're really having trouble with our source data, so we just want to get it into staging so that we can further transform the data in staging. So I'm just going to execute this task here, and as the data goes through, we get all green here, so all 3274 rows. If we come back here and we execute the step, we see that all 3,270 rows of data are imported into our package. So that's really the process that you can go through. Again, just to reiterate, even though this data is now in staging, it doesn't mean that it's in its final state that we need for getting the data into our data mart. We're still going to have to deal with that transformation piece, except we just won't do it during the initial ETL process into staging. We could transform that later after it's in SQL Server inside of a separate table or in the same table using cast or convert commands. So that's how we deal with some very common problems during the ETL process to get data into